We are go. We are go. Okay. Okay. Hey guys, my name's Helena. If you don't know who I am, welcome to my YouTube channel. I primarily live in Instagram land, but I wanted to make this video to discuss my experience with recently being admitted to a psychiatric ward. Before I start, I wanted to please, if anybody feels that they may be triggered by discussion around psychiatric conditions, suicide, depression, and mental health in general, please do not watch the video. Or if you feel that watching the video may be helpful for you, but you do feel like it could be triggering, ask somebody to please watch it with you so that you have somebody to support and debrief with afterwards and decide how you feel. My main reason for sharing this is not for sympathy or attention. It's because I know that this is actually a really hard discussion for people. Discussions around mental health are getting better. Discussions around depression, anxiety, burnout, ADHD are becoming more normalized and easier to talk through. But discussions around serious mental illness, beyond taking care of mental health, mental illness is still very uncomfortable for people, very unknown for a lot of people. It's beyond the scope of we all experience that sometimes. When it's talked about, people don't really know how to respond or can be quite dismissive. And so sometimes it's not even about knowing what's the right thing to say, but sometimes it's just knowing what not to say. Maybe some of this video may help with that. If anybody is watching this because they're thinking that there's somebody in their family or their friend group that they think should probably be admitted and they're not sure how to go about the process, I hope this is helpful. Or if you yourself are watching because you think that this is something that could apply to you, I hope that this is helpful. For anybody else, I hope it's at least interesting and provides you with some different perspective and opens your scope on the idea of who might fit into the category of people who may be admitted to a psych ward. I don't necessarily fit the mold. I don't look like, talk like, act like somebody who would typically be pictured to be going into a psychiatric ward. And that in itself was actually something that made it hard for me to get noticed. It almost let me slip through the gaps, and it could have been really quite dangerous. To give a quick background before talking about how I actually got admitted, I am diagnosed ADHD, depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive tendencies. And with my depression, it tends to be quite cyclical. I usually have 2 big lows a year. I have all through my adult life as long as I can remember. And the last few years, each low has been a little bit more difficult to manage on my own. I was medicated for ADHD a couple of years ago, and that's been very helpful with regulating my mood and helping with my depression. However, these lows are still coming up and they are still becoming more and more intense and more dangerous each time. This time I had a discussion with my sister about some behaviours that I had, and I will not specify them because I do not want to be sharing ideas, that I could see were not normal, and I knew that I would be concerned if somebody in my family or somebody who I loved was doing that, even though while it was me myself it didn't necessarily feel dangerous or concerning. I spoke to my sister about it because I have enough self-awareness to realise that it's not necessarily normal. She responded by asking me to please book in for the psychologist that I'd been avoiding booking into for almost 3 months. And I agreed because, you know, once again, if it was someone in my family, I would hope that if I asked them to book in that they would. So I booked in to see my psychologist, and this was my first visit with him. The appointment was meant to be on a Wednesday, and I got a call that morning to say that he'd been had to go to a family emergency and then they needed to cancel to go to the next day. And I was quite uncomfortable because I was sitting with a lot of big, strange feelings. But the fact that they could book it into the very next day was okay, obviously. If it had been pushed back for a week or like an open-end date, I don't really know how I would have gone. But anyhow, got in the next day. I actually was out that morning, out at breakfast with one of my girlfriends. Have a very normal catch-up date. I'm sure if you asked her, she would not have guessed that I was about to be admitted to the psych ward. Normal chat, mental health definitely came up. We talk about that, I talk about it regularly. But it was, yeah, just a good chat between girlfriends. She dropped me off at my psychologist. My appointment was at 10 o'clock, and at 11 o'clock when the appointment should have ended, he asked me if I was comfortable to please stay, that he was going to ask his receptionist to push back his other appointments because he wasn't quite comfortable to leave what we had discussed without looking into a couple of things further. At this point, there wasn't any big flags, but there'd been a couple of things that I'd said that he wanted to explore a little bit deeper, because how I was presenting and how I was talking all looked fine, but there was words that I was saying that indicated that I wasn't. I'm really glad that he had the insight and didn't just go, oh yeah, well look, like she's well put together, she doesn't seem distressed, and let me go. I'm very glad that he had the insight to spot that something was not right and to extend that appointment, pushing back other clients, which, you know, is not necessarily ideal. But to know that this was serious. That appointment ended up going on until 2:30. So with him, he ran me through a series of questions and identified that I was an active suicide risk. I didn't necessarily consider myself that way, but it helped me realise that I actually was at high risk. We then called the hotline for the hospital or for admissions, and they ran me through a series of questions and also identified me as a high suicide risk, and they advised that I should come in. And so an ambulance was called and we continued chatting, just me, the psychologist, and my sister was then called to come and hang out with me so she could come with me to the hospital. And so we sat talking and waited until the ambulance arrived. In the ambulance, they ask a bunch of questions again. Their notes then as well confirm high suicide risk, and the admission process once we got to the hospital was quite slow, as these things tend to be, but gave me a lot of time to sort of think about where I really was at and how real it was. There wouldn't be all this fuss if this wasn't dangerous, even though I still feel very calm inside. And so I guess, side note on this, my depression isn't necessarily always shown as sadness. There are many forms of depression, and in this case, my depression was more dissociative. I had a very disconnected feeling from me and the world, and particularly me and anything beyond the day I was living. I was in a state where I was living each day as a single day, and it felt like there was no connection to the next day. It made it very hard to do any work that was for following weeks or time. It made it very hard to picture having to do that, living one day at a time for a long period of time. And I'd gotten to the point where I'd decided I'd rather not, is sort of where I was at without going into too much detail. And so this depression didn't have me crying, things didn't have me feeling any sort of self-hatred. It actually felt like it was the nice thing to do. In my mind, I guess it works similarly to when you euthanize a dog, because it's actually the kind of thing to do. Of course, it's sad for everybody, but it's what's best. That was kind of how I felt for myself. And I was a little bit disappointed I wasn't going to be able to have a party for it, which once again just shows just my head was not in a very good space. So we got to the psychiatric acute ward around 2:30, 3 o'clock, and I didn't get to bed until 10 p.m. So within that time I got assessed by a psychiatrist there again, who once again highly recommended I proceed with admission, and we talked about potential other diagnoses. I, through this process, have not been formally diagnosed with anything else, but there are many notes on a couple of other things. I was feeling a little bit like I was just speaking on repeat at that point, but my psychologist had I guess guided me on certain things that I'd said to him that he flagged as the most important things to make sure I did repeat when I was asked questions at the hospital, so I didn't once again slip through the system because I looked so I was kind of making jokes about things that I probably shouldn't have been making jokes about, but it's just my way of dealing with it, and I felt that it was okay, and I was told that it was very not okay. We saw some other patients in the waiting room that were interesting characters. We got to hear some fun stories. There was a guy sitting in the hallway singing "Kissed by a Rose on a Grave," or whatever that song is called. We were all sort of humming and singing along, and then when I finally got taken through, I was actually going to be admitted to the acute ward. Now this is something I guess maybe useful information. So there's the acute ward, which is more of a longer stay ward, and there are a lot of very sick people in that ward. And then there's the emergency ward, which is a short stay ward, and the entire purpose of the short stay ward is to just keep you safe until you can go back out. So actual treatment is done in the acute ward, whereas just keeping you safe is done in the emergency ward. While I was meant to be admitted to the acute ward, it was told to me that in my situation, I may have been a little bit vulnerable in that ward, and a lot of those patients will call out things. Essentially, I was told because I am a young, decent-looking female, I would probably be sort of yelled at, and it would be something that could potentially cause upset for other patients and myself. And so I was actually put into the emergency ward instead, which is a much quieter, much smaller ward. The pro of that is obviously that I got to stay in a quieter ward and I didn't have to deal with other patients who were going to be screaming at me or calling out rude comments. But it also meant that I couldn't actually be treated on the ward. I was just held there to stay safe, which for me was very frustrating because I felt the need to want to achieve things on a daily basis, but you kind of just stayed there and didn't do much, which was a bit frustrating for me, and some of the other patients. But I do understand the differences in the ward types. I didn't have spare clothes and things with me because I wasn't obviously planning on going in, so my mum brought clothes for me the next day, a bag of clothes and things for me, and when I did get that delivered as well, and all my toiletries and things, drawstrings have to come out of everything. I was only allowed to keep a certain amount of clothing in my room with me at a time, and my toiletries had to be handed back in every day, and I'd ask for them every time I wanted to have a shower or brush my teeth or what have you, and hand them back in. The ward that I was in had a shared ward of 4 beds, and then it had 2 single rooms. The 2 single rooms are primarily used for under 18s, and fortunately there wasn't an under 18 in the ward, and so I got one of the single rooms, which I was really happy about because I wasn't sleeping well at the time. I don't sleep well at the best of times, and so having a private room was definitely helpful for me. If I'm tossing about in bed or I need to stand up because my legs are restless, I'm not doing it in a shared room where I feel like I'm going to be disturbing other people. So that was really beneficial for me, and I got to stay in there essentially the whole time I was in there. There was some under 18s who came in, but on rotation of the other room until my last day. The ward itself was really boring, and I found it very triggering to be in an environment with so little stimulation, and quite difficult. So I didn't have my phone obviously at all for the whole week. On the very first day I was actually a bit anxious because I knew that I had a client call coming up and I hadn't been able to let anybody know why I was going to be ignoring them, and I had no idea how long I was going to be staying in for. So they did allow me access to my phone supervised so that I could either send out a group email or something. I decided to just make a post on my Instagram because if somebody had tried to get in contact with me in any way other than email and hadn't seen that or wasn't going to receive that, then they would just assume that I was ignoring them. So the only way that I could make sure that everyone was going to see it is somewhere that's central, and that was my Instagram page. So I basically publicly announced, hey, I've just been admitted to the psych ward until further notice. I'm sorry if I don't get back to you, see you on the other side, sort of thing. Which was a pretty confronting step to have to take. I would have shared it anyhow, but I probably would have liked to have done that in my own time. But that's all I really had time for. So I posted that, didn't get to see any of the responses or anything until I got out a week later. As far as things to do on the ward, there was a TV, there was beads to be able to make necklaces or bracelets or key rings or things like that. You could draw. There was books, but they were definitely not the types of books that I wanted to read, and I didn't think the books were necessarily appropriate for the ward. There were many things about the ward that struck me as odd for the types of patients that need to be in there. Some of those sorts of things were like the fact that there was a lot of bright colours. There were blue walls and purple walls and red, yellow, green, blue seats, and just like paintings and splashes of things like a play group or a preschool type thing. Lots of bright colours, which is very overstimulating, with LED lights as well. And I thought, like, do they know what crowd they're dealing with here? Like, this is a very overwhelming environment. Also, the table that we ate at was definitely not large enough for the 6 people, and we all had to sit and eat at the same time. But hospital food is little bits and pieces of things. So all the bits and pieces of everybody's clutter on a table that wasn't quite big enough for everybody, and you were sitting like elbow to elbow. In that kind of ward, you are dealing with people who are not necessarily on top of their personal hygiene, because they're not in a state that they have the energy for that, and that is no fault of theirs, but we were right on top of each other. And to be eating your meal next to people who you could smell had not showered for days, while everybody's always touching and there's clutter on the table, was a very anxious environment, and to me that's a massive oversight. Back to the books, all of the books were novels, which is fine. I'm sure there can be novels in the ward, but I thought, for me, I felt a real need to feel some sort of productivity, and if there was books in there that could guide people through that experience, I thought they would have been helpful as an addition to the novels. People could read the novels if they want to read the novels. There was a set of Goosebumps books, for example. But also, like, why wasn't there anything there on mindset or on moving on from something like this, or to teach people how to journal, which I think are resources that absolutely should be in that kind of ward for the people who want them. They don't need to be forced on anybody if it's not a planned activity, but I think they should be there, because the general consensus on the ward, we're talking with other patients, is that everybody kind of felt like they were sitting around twiddling their thumbs and wanted to feel like they were doing something for themselves, and there wasn't really an opportunity for that. There was books with like there's Mandela drawings and things, the therapy colouring in stuff. To me, no thank you. But I was like, why not also, in addition to having templates for colouring in, do you not also have templates for journaling prompts, so people can take one away, sit and write and talk through their, write through their thoughts, jot down their thoughts, brain dump. There's a lot going on in your head in that kind of space and in that kind of situation. We weren't really encouraged to write or journal or anything like that. We had a visit with either a psychologist or a psychiatrist each of the weekdays, but on the weekends we didn't have any of that. And so the weekend itself was really quite frustrating until Sunday afternoon. So I was admitted on a Thursday for a fun story. We found out that there was karaoke. I'd made a joke about Disney karaoke because we were kind of humming at the table or something. And then one of the nurses said, we actually have karaoke. Do you want me to get it? And we're like, yeah, bring it out. I really didn't think anyone was going to play. I thought maybe it was going to play in the background and people might sing, but not with the mics. It started off a little slow, but eventually all 6 of us in the psych ward were singing karaoke, and we actually had a lot of fun. Everybody had a bit of a laugh, and it was a good energy release because we were all feeling quite tense and understimulated from not having anything to do, and obviously no appointments on the weekends. So we just kind of just left to hang out over the weekend. So my favourite thing was that we were purposefully choosing either songs that were very appropriate for mentally unstable people or songs that were quite explicit. The entertainment value came from the fact of knowing that that ward is right next to the emergency department, and the emergency department is sitting there with a sign that says like psychiatric emergency care. So the people in that waiting room can see that that's the psych ward and can hear karaoke of all these explicit lyrics coming out, and we were belting it. So that had a lot of entertainment value. We let a lot of energy out with that. We did that for like 3 hours. That was the only time we did that in the time I was in there, but that was probably like the funnest time I had in there. Other than that, you're kind of just coping. You're just in survival mode sort of thing, waiting to find out, are they going to send me home? Are they going to recommend I go over to the other ward? Are they going to change my meds? Are they not going to change my meds? For me, while I was in there, their main goal was to try and get me sleeping, which didn't really work well. So they tried a couple of different meds in there. Each of them only worked for 2 days before not working, which is my general response to sleeping tablets, or different methods to try and make me sleep. They work for a day or two and then I adapt. And so when it got to my 7th day, it was when I was going to lose the private room and go into the shared ward because there was another under 18 person come in. And I actually asked just on that day if I could go home, because if the main goal was to try and get me sleeping and I wasn't going to have my actual psychiatric medicine changed in that ward because it's short stay, I didn't see a point in me staying there because my sleep was only going to be worse if I was on the shared ward. So that's essentially how I was able to leave in that consultation with a psychiatrist, I was still deemed unsafe to be by myself, and so I was discharged on condition that someone would stay with me. So in that appointment, she called my mum and asked if she'd be happy to stay with me, and she was, thank goodness. And my mum lived with me for I think 2.5 weeks or something like that after, and then I just told her, you know, like, you're safe to go home. I'm well enough to know that if I'm falling back into that space, I will ask for help. And so it's still something that is there for me, but I have greater awareness around it now and what's dangerous and what's okay to just sit with. What else about the ward could I tell you? Food. Wow, I really wish I had my phone with me in there for the main thing. Like, I think, you know, a day on the plate in the psych ward would have been great content. The engagement would have been huge. But we actually did get to choose our own meals, which was, I guess, nice as far as these things go. So I always basically just asked the dietitian's assistant which meal is going to have the highest protein and give me all the veg. So I'd get like roast chicken breast, which was essentially like a whole breast, so that was good, and all of the veg. So that kind of thing. For breakfast I was getting oats or porridge, whatever you want to call it, and eggs and baked beans. And I also, when my mum brought my clothes, I got her to bring me a bag of protein, so I was putting protein powder in my oats. So I was still able to keep my protein content up. I was definitely snacking on the desserts while I was in there. I came out about 3 to 4 kilos heavier than when I went in a week. That was not all fat gain. I was definitely holding some fluid from the different medications I tried. I tend to blow up when I have different medications, plus there was probably more salt in the food just being commercially processed. And so that sort of came down a little bit in the time afterwards, but I've made no active effort to try and lose weight since getting out. I was going into a build season anyway, so I'm just rolling with it. Something that was surprising to me was the level of patient turnover. Essentially, as soon as there was a bed free, there was someone else in it. I think there was maybe 10 or 11 people in there in the week that I was in there. So obviously I started off being the newest person. By the time I got to the end of the week, I was the longest stay there. The ward typically is only like a 3 or 4 day stay maximum. It's not really meant to be somewhere to hold people for very long because, as I said, it's not a treatment ward, it's just a safety ward. But the sad thing was, you know, when people come in, it's almost like you're in jail because people are like, oh, is this your first time? What are you in for? And the sad thing is, I think there was only one other person in the whole time I was in there that was their first time in there, which to me shows that the system doesn't work. While you're in there, they keep you safe, and then you are let go. So when I was discharged, I did have follow-up calls from the hospital for the first sort of 5 days. I had calls every second day for the first 5 days. Once they found out that I had an appointment with my psychologist, I got no more follow-up from the hospital. I am now a month, I think tomorrow, out of hospital, and I still haven't been able to get into my psychiatrist yet. We tried to move my appointment forward, but he's booked out until the end of the year, so I kept my original appointment, which I've had since the beginning of the year, to be able to see him next week. And at that point, I may or may not have my medicine changed, but essentially I was in a crisis situation, and because I have my own psychiatrist, the ward could not change my medication. But I was also not able to get into my psychiatrist any sooner, even with this emergency. And so essentially I've just had to stay on the same medication. In the meantime, whether that's the right medication for me to be on or not, the fact that the system works that way is appalling, in my opinion. And a lot of people, when they do get out, if they're maybe not as proactive as I am, maybe don't have the same support as I am, aren't necessarily going to be booking in with their psychologist regularly afterwards as well. So I've been seeing my psychologist initially every week, and then now it's moved to every 2 weeks. And with my psychiatrist appointment coming as well, it's very easy to not. And if you don't, it's very easy to just slip off the system. And so, especially once people start to feel a little bit better, and everyone stops checking in on them to make sure that they do these things, they don't. And when they don't, and particularly if they're not on the right medications, or if they've run out of their medications or gone off their medications, they end up back in there. And there were some people in there who'd been on that ward, 5, 6, 7 times. There was a gentleman who had been between that ward, the acute ward and rehab, I think he said 12 or 13 times. And when he was leaving, you could see how scared he was of himself. You knew that he was either coming back in or that he wasn't coming in because he wasn't going to make it next time. And that's real sad. Because the support's just not there in the public system. Sorry. It just, it guts me, you know. I have incredible support, and I knew that when I was coming out I had great support. I had, 4 or 5 calls a day every day that I was in there. There was other people that had no calls. I had my mum and sister drop off clothes to me, and then later on did another delivery with some snacks and books for me because I was going mad with nothing to do. There were some people that didn't have visitors, and in the public system it just needs to be better, and I don't know exactly what it is that can be done without supplying an enormous amount of funds to it, but there has got to be something that provides better resources for these people who don't have the same support on the outside. You can't just be kept safe and then let go, because it's so temporary and it does not leave people any better. And if anything, I think every time they come back in, they lose a little bit more faith in themselves. And so that was a big takeaway for me, and I think it's something that once I know I am fully well, right now I do need to just focus on me. But it's something that I think I want to be a bit of an advocate for in time. As far as the types of people who were in there was all sorts. There was, people who just, looked like somebody that you just see in the shop that you wouldn't notice because they're just, plain normal people. There were some people who were definitely on a lot of medication to be kept well while on the ward. Moving slowly, talking slowly, definitely on a lot of medication to hold them out of like a psychosis state. And then there was those of us who were in there. There was majority of the people on that ward are there for self-harm or suicide. And you just couldn't pick it. One of the guys who was in there on the first day that he was in, we were having a chat, and he's like, I would never guess it for you. Like, you could have fooled me. And this is something I realized through this whole process, is that if I wasn't asking for the help, nobody would have seen it. If I didn't want the help, this never would have been caught. I just would have been able to go through with what I was thinking about doing. And that's really sad. Like, it wasn't being scanned for. There was one psychologist who I actually felt like was trying to convince me that I wasn't serious, and if anything, it was dangerous, and it actually put me into, I went into a very strange state the next day while on the ward, and I was really detached, and if anything, kind of just determined to get out so that I could prove her wrong, which is awful. But it's very dangerous when somebody's not taking you seriously, because I almost had to sell the idea that this is what I was thinking, because I didn't look like somebody who was thinking that way. And I think their training needs to be a lot better. Honestly, the best training of anyone who I spoke to was through my own psychologist, and that's not because he knows me well. That was my first ever visit with him. Now him and I are getting along well, and he's worked out how to work well with me. But if I wasn't so forward with what I was thinking, if I wasn't so I guess in tune with myself and good at describing and I guess creating analogies for the way I was thinking about things that somebody who's not thinking that way could understand, it wouldn't have been caught. I would have slipped through, and that's very dangerous. And I think it just happens so much more often than it should. There needs to be better training on looking at the people who are high achievers, who are not necessarily the sad kind of depressed, or not outwardly the sad kind of depressed. Some people are the sad kind of depressed and don't look it. But this is, I think, a lot of what I've experienced is probably the kind that's experienced by a lot of people who, when you hear it, it's like, you're so shocked. You're like, but they were so energetic, and they were so giving, and they were so loving, and they were so talented, and what a waste of a life, and what a shame. to them, that really felt like their best option. And many people have missed it along the way. There would have been some sort of sign at some point. They would have said something at some point, but because they look like they're doing fine, everyone wants to tell you, nah, you're doing fine. Don't worry, everybody feels like that. You'll be right. But there's a big difference between what everybody feels and you'll be right and being at that point. It's not the same realm. Some of the questions. Are they gentle with how they treat you on admission given your fragile state of mind? Yeah, they were gentle and lovely. On admission, that was all very caring as far as my experience. The psychiatrist who did my interview at the TAC ward was great. Can you leave at any time? No. Whether you're voluntary or involuntary admission, once you are admitted, they will only let you go if they deem you safe to go, or with parameters that provide you safety. So even if somebody voluntarily admits themselves, if once you're in there they say you are not safe to head out today, then you will not be able to head out today. So once you're in, you are, I guess, essentially treated the same whether you're voluntary or involuntary. Do I believe it had a positive impact on my recovery and well-being as intended? I left the ward saying I don't necessarily feel any different. I have all the same thoughts, but I'm more aware of how dangerous they are. And that I think the main thing for me leaving was to leave with a hope that there would be a point in time that I wouldn't feel that way anymore. It's much easier to sit with those feelings next to you if you can hope and believe that at some point you won't have to sit with them next to you. Without hope, there's no reason to keep doing the work on a daily basis. And so while I wasn't any better, my mind was still thinking a lot of the same things. My urges were still the same. I was able to recognize that I didn't need to act on those. And so that was the difference. And that was just essentially time and the discussions that I'd had with myself and realizations I'd let myself bring. Essentially, the ward did not provide me with that stuff that I did for myself. So once again, it's a bit of a shame of the ward. It's just not actually designed for treatment. How is one still able to take care of stuff outside, like pets and planned deliveries and all? So I was lucky enough to be able to have my mum look after Albie, so she wasn't staying here, but she would come by, every morning before work and every night after work to give him his medication and feed him and change his litter. He was left on his own through the day though, but if somebody didn't have somebody to mind their pets, I don't actually know what they would do. It's not something that the hospital was actively trying to organise things for. As far as deliveries here, they all ended up at the post office. And like I said, I was able to get access to my phone very briefly. I think people may be able to do the same thing to access if you need to move money around in bank accounts or something to make sure that your rent can still get paid or something like that. But if you're given any access to something like that, it's brief and it's supervised. I think all of the other questions I probably answered. I want to thank you all for listening, for being curious, for being so supportive and non-judgmental. I'd really hope that you can take something away from this and opening your mind up, or listening a little bit more carefully if someone's telling you that they're not okay. Don't dismiss it by telling them that everybody feels the same, because maybe they're just not actually able to articulate just how serious what they're feeling is. Always just direct people towards help. You can call a helpline to ask for advice on how to help them, and there are so many different helplines available. Even ones now where you can text, you don't need to have a phone call. There are so many areas for help, but suicide still takes way too many lives each year. It's something that I will probably battle many times in my life. Essentially, this is something that comes up at some level every time I go into a low. But as I said before, this is sort of just becoming more and more difficult to manage on my own. I really hope that obviously I end up on the right treatment plan, that I don't have to deal with this every time. One conversation that really stuck with me after getting out of hospital is one that I had with one of my ex-bosses. One thing he said to me was, "Helena, if there was anyone who was going to be given this, to be able to do something with it, it would be you. And I think that's an enormous part of what is going to help me through these phases. If I know that there's a purpose for it, this is happening for me to be able to help others. It's not just happening to me, it's happening for me so that I can have a voice, because a lot of people in this community, in the mental state that I have been in, don't have a voice, or don't know how to use their voice, or don't have a voice that many people are going to listen to. And so I'm in a bit of a unique position, and I hope to be able to help in some way, make changes in some way, whether that's for one or two individuals, or whether that's for a part of how the system works. There's something I can do with this, and that is a massive driver for me to get well. Every time I know that I'm going to fall into these again, I can use that as a driver to get well. And so if this has helped in any way, I'd really like to hear how. It would be nice to know where this is going and how this is helping people, because it's a very uncomfortable thing to share, to be very honest. I'll close it up by saying at this point, I am safe. I am still needing a lot of support. I am still working through this phase, but I am safe, and I am doing my best to just carry on as normal with these extra supports to help me get through. Hoping that at some point in the future I don't need those extra supports anymore, and that I can feel truly well. And until I am well, I'm going to do my best to get well and to hopefully help others along the way. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I don't know how engaging or exciting this was. It's not my normal sort of lively, upbeat chit chat, but I just hope it helps. Thank you so much, guys.